Coming to you from Southern California, this is Mindset, mental health news and information. I'm your host, James Curtis. On today's show,
I'm Nyla Branscombe, and I'm a social psychologist, professor at University of Kansas.
I have a conversation with Professor Nyla Branscombe, and she talks about her research on attitudes about torture and how it can help us understand the psychology of excessive force. But first, this news from the Mindset Report. The Mindset Report available online at mindsetreport.com. The Mindset Report, your most comprehensive online source for mental health news. Today's Mindset Report is underwritten by Responsibility, a complete guide to bystander intervention by Alan Berkowitz, who is committed to the idea that the solution to health and social justice problems require that we engage as bystanders. Responsibility is available online at lulu.com. Lulu spelled Lulu. And if you like what we're doing here at Mindset, please log on to our website, mindsetshow.com, and click on the Support Us link and shop our affiliate vendors. There you can find everything from electronics to vitamins, and your purchases help the programming here at the Mindset Show. From SciPost.org, the science behind many antidepressant medications appears to be backwards. So say the authors of a paper that challenges the prevailing ideas about the nature of depression in some of the world's most commonly prescribed medications that are called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs. The paper, posted by the journal Neuroscience and Biobehavioral Reviews, challenges the so-called low serotonin theory, which is the basis for SSRI medications. SSRIs work by keeping serotonin levels high. According to the research, those serotonin-boosting medications actually make it harder for patients to recover, especially in the short term. This, according to lead author Paul Andrews, an assistant professor of psychology, neuroscience, and behavior at Canada's McMaster University. From Harvard Health Publications, if you've ever crawled under the covers worrying about a problem or a long to-do list, you know that those racing thoughts may rob you of a good night's sleep. Sleep disturbances, like having a hard time falling asleep or staying asleep, affect millions of Americans. Well, a small study suggests that mindfulness meditation, a mind-calming practice that focuses on breathing and awareness of the present moment, can help. The study, which appears in this week's JAMA Internal Medicine, included 49 middle-aged and older adults who had trouble sleeping, have completed a mindfulness awareness program that taught them meditation and other exercises designed to help them focus on moment-by-moment experiences, thoughts, and emotions. The other half completed a sleep education class that taught them ways to improve their sleep habits. Those in the mindfulness group had less insomnia, fatigue, and depression at the end of the study. And finally, this item from the Huffington Post: exposure to negative and violent media may have serious and long-lasting psychological effects. The work of British psychologist Dr. Graham Davey, who specializes in the psychological effects of media violence, suggests that violent media exposure can contribute to the development of stress, anxiety, depression, and even post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. As psychologist Steven Pinker and international studies professor Andrew Mack observe, the world is not going to hell in a handbasket. Despite what the headlines suggest, violence has actually decreased and the quality of life has improved for millions of people. For more on these and other mental health stories, visit the Mindset Report at mindsetreport.com. We're back with our main topic, the psychology of excessive force, right after this break. back to Mindset, mental health news and information. I am your host, James Curtis. You can find us on the web at mindsetshow.com and on our Facebook page, Mindset Show page, facebook.com/Mindset Show page. You can follow us on Twitter. We tweet with the handle at Mindset Show. The news of excessive force by police from Ferguson, Missouri to New York has made the headlines regularly, and it seems like a lot more frequently as of late. One of the latest high-profile incidents of reported excessive force on the behalf of law enforcement comes out of Alabama, involving a 57-year-old Indian man, Surajbhai Patel, who was paralyzed when he was forcibly taken to the ground by an officer. The officer was subsequently disciplined and faces termination. Not all communities around the country are having that level of problem, despite the information in the news. I had a conversation with LA Times reporter David Zucchino about some of the tactics and approaches that are being used in one town to head off this kind of unfortunate mishap. My guest is David Zucchino. He's a reporter for the LA Times. And David, thanks a lot for joining me. You've done some great reporting, the most recent of which I read had to do with a meeting that you covered back in January of this year, 2015, in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, between law enforcement and the community regarding encounters that cops have with African-American men. How did that meeting come about, and what was the purpose?
I saw a notice in one of the local papers that the meeting was going to happen, and started calling around and talked to the police department in Rocky Mount and to a member of the city's Human Relations Commission. And together they decided to have this. They were concerned about not becoming like Ferguson or Staten Island, or not having situations like that. And they wanted to sort of get ahead of any problems. They haven't had any serious problems in Rocky Mount, but they were concerned that something might develop. They figured it was a good idea for the police and the community just to get together and talk.
And the interesting thing about that meeting is that, as you noted in your article and as you just alluded to, there have not been any horrific mishaps between police and the community, the African-American community in Rocky Mount. This is sort of a preemptive strike, if you will, a preventative measure?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the way they phrased it. They just wanted to get everybody to talk together and clear the air. I mean, there have been a few incidents, nothing of the scale of Ferguson, but on both sides, on the Human Rights Commission, and I talked to the head of the NAACP there and said there had been some tense encounters and complaints from people of being mistreated by the police, and they didn't want it to get any worse, and they wanted to clear the air.
So what was your takeaway from the meeting? You attended the meeting. What was the mood like? Was it successful? Because oftentimes these types of meetings can be... people aren't really talking with each other. People are talking, but there's no real communication going on.
Yeah, in this case, there wasn't any real confrontation. There was a lot of listening going on. The police and prosecutors basically put on sort of a demonstration and had different experts come up and talk about how you should behave if you are stopped by the police, what police procedures were, what to expect from the criminal justice system, just a lot of nuts and bolts and details. And then they opened it up to questions, and there were quite a few questions from the audience, which was almost entirely African-American, not entirely, but heavily African-American. And by the way, the police, all but one of the police officers was African-American as well. And the police answered the questions, but they were fairly circumspect. They didn't go into any great detail, but they did answer the questions. And I think it ended on a good note. I talked to people afterwards, and everyone was glad they had it, and we're talking about hoping to have it again.
What were some of those questions that the audience had for the police members of the panel there?
One was, under what circumstances could a police officer draw his weapon, fire his weapon, or use force against someone who had been stopped? And a lot of these were in the context of a traffic stop.
Sure. And did the police seem to be readily engaging with the audience, or was it more of a prepared response format?
The first part, was definitely prepared. I mean, it was a sort of a show that they put on. But secondly, I mean, the questions, there was some interaction and some back and forth and some follow-up questions, and they were fairly responsive, but they spoke in sort of police mode and very strict in legal terminology, and it wasn't a casual conversation, to put it that way.
All right. And it's noteworthy that I understand the Rocky Mount Police Chief, James Moore, is black. He's African-American.
Correct, yeah. He's an African-American, and he was one of the people who got the thing started.
Now, you also had an opportunity to speak with some of the audience members, a couple of young men who were there. What was your takeaway from those conversations?
Yeah, those two young men said they came because they were genuinely curious themselves about the police point of view, and as I mentioned in the story, one young man said he had just recently been stopped by the police, and he did not think he had done anything wrong and was not given a ticket, but said he thought he was treated fairly by the officer, although when he told his mother about it later, she thought that he had been, quote, profiled. But both of those young men said they were glad the police did it and that they sort of opened their eyes to the police point of view of things and seeing it from the other side. So they were fairly satisfied. I will note that they were practically the only young African-American people there. Everyone else was either middle-aged or older, and the police chief said he was a little disappointed in that, and he said, as it turned out that night, there was a free showing of Selma downtown, and he said that a lot of young people went to that.
So he had a little competition for his meeting.
Yeah, exactly. He didn't realize it at the time when he scheduled it.
Which brings up the related question, and that is, was this a one-off for the police department and the community, or is this the beginning of a series of steps that might actually make a dent in the difference?
Yeah, I asked the chief about that, and he said he would like to hold more, that there was nothing planned, but they were going to look into having more meetings.
Now, David Cecchino, you've also covered, in addition to Ferguson, an incident that happened a couple hours south of Rocky Mount, North Carolina, in a town called Bladenton, involving a 17-year-old Lennon Lacey, an apparent suicide. Community members took issue with the fact that it was a suicide, and there's talk that it was indeed a lynching. And although this was not at the hands, apparently, of a police officer, the idea of law enforcement, how they handled it, and their interaction with the community is still at issue. Is there any movement in that community to try to come together and resolve the tensions that arose from that incident?
No, I didn't get any sense of that. I went down for a rally a few days after this in the town where a couple thousand people turned out, and there was a lot of hostility and bitterness towards the police. There were no incidents, and the police were along the march, and there was no hostility, but they were very suspicious of the police effort and of the police investigation, did not think it was thorough at all, and blatant, and said just up front that they believed it was because the victim was black. I talked to the mother and the brother of the young man who conceded that it was possible he had committed suicide, but they don't think the investigation was thorough enough, and that there were a lot of questions that pointed in another direction that they said were not pursued, and the state NAACP made the same points. But there was no talk that day of getting the police and people in the community together for any kind of a meeting. I think tensions were a little too high at that point.
As you look at the development and indeed the occurrence of these incidents across the country, some of which have resulted in a lot of outcry and upheaval, as in Ferguson and in New York, others not so much, what's your takeaway from the trend, the mood with these types of incidents, the encounters between young black men and police?
I think there is just a lot of suspicion, misunderstanding, and not hatred, but I guess hostility on both sides. I mean, I don't think either side really fully understands how the other side thinks, and there is really a gulf between the two communities, and that's why I wanted to write about this one attempt by one community to try to overcome that separation.
The LA Times reporter David Cecchino. Hopefully that gulf is going to be a little bit closer because of the great reporting and the great work that you're doing, and I hope I get to talk to you again sometime.
Okay, thanks. Good talking to you.
Again, LA Times reporter David Zucchino. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter. He covers national and international news for the Los Angeles Times. He spoke to me from his base in Durham, North Carolina. The next interview that I had that's related to this issue is really the main topic of this issue. Nyla Branscombe is a University of Kansas professor, and the report that I heard of her study having to do with torture caught my ear because of the dynamic that it suggested. We're going to get to that interview in just a moment. But as promised last week, I want to acknowledge, shout out, and say thank you to all of the phenomenal support that Mindset has been receiving both on Facebook and on Twitter. Shout out to a few of the Twitter followers. I will try to get to you all over the course of the next several weeks. Keith Teller, The Keith Teller Show. Keith Teller he's just a funny guy. He's based out of Detroit, Michigan, and he just has one of those humorous approaches and affects that is always good for stress relief. Keith, thanks so much for your support. Anxiety and Wellness on Twitter, Tech Fact on Twitter, Childhood Facts, Supplement News, Michael Croutrier, Kimberly Leonard, Men's Health, Rosalind Charles are just a few. We're going to talk about the idea and the dynamic, the psychology behind what cops, what law enforcement thinks, what they experience, the kind of mindset, if you will, that allows some of the really horrific results that have been witnessed around the country with respect to interactions that simply go very, very wrong. Here's my interview and my conversation with Nyla Branscombe. I've looked at the selected publications that you have that are listed on the website for the University of Kansas. There's a number of pieces that have to do with minority groups and discrimination and the like. How did you come to focus on that area?
Yeah, sure. Well, I generally study both, as you point out, the victims of discrimination, essentially, and how they cope with it, but also, in a sense, perpetrators and their motivations and identity concerns. And so, at a broadest level, I'm really interested in identity, who people think they are, and the treatment that they receive on the basis of that group membership. It's the basis of those identities. So it makes sense then that the social identity of people who are members of more advantaged groups or powerful groups can be at stake when they learn that their group has perpetrated harm towards others. Now, we can engage in all kinds of justification of that harm, and then it won't be a big emotional problem for us. But under some circumstances, we may be unable to justify that harm doing, and we may even feel guilt for the harmful things our group has done. So I've studied both the recipients of the harm doing and those who are members of groups perpetrating the harm.
Then am I not entirely off base in my association or my reaction to the study that you've engaged in? The context that I heard it in had to do with torture and how members of one group view torture committed by members of their group as opposed to committed by members of a group that they do not belong to. Is it indeed appropriate to analogize that dynamic to, say, excessive force by police officers?
Potentially.
You don't like that?
Well, okay, so if I'm a police officer and members of my group have done harm, I may well be tempted to see it as legitimate. After all, we're under threat. There's all kinds of ways in which officers could make sense of another officer's decision. and legitimize it. In fact, may even defend their behavior as perfectly reasonable under trying circumstances and so forth.
Is that a fitting extension of the analytical underpinnings or dynamics of your work, or is that a stretch?
Yeah, no, it's a reasonable one. That is, if to the extent that people value their identity group, they will be motivated to protect that identity. And one way of protecting it is when you're faced with real harm doing or something that is seen as potentially immoral, is to engage in some kind of legitimization. There's all kinds of forms of legitimization you can reach for, though. I mean, you can, in our particular work, we looked at the possibility of not empathizing with those people who have been harmed. If you feel less empathy for them, then it's easier to continue to feel better about your own group's actions, the harmful actions. You can also legitimize it. You can blame the victims themselves, that they really caused this to happen. It's their own fault. It's not about us. It's about them, after all. And so on. So there are an awful lot of strategies people can use to justify their group's actions. There will be conditions under which it's very, very difficult to do so. And then people may feel like their identity, their whole group's identity, has been tainted. And they may attempt to distance themselves, sort of to say, I'm not like those other ones. So to protect their personal identity, they may attempt to distance themselves, and so on. So that there's a lot of strategies and contextual factors that can affect which strategy people will use. But in particular, in this paper on perceptions of torture, participants were able to defend their group's identity when they've been confronted with very clear evidence of torture that they couldn't deny, that is seen as not just illegal but immoral by many people. So the ways in which our participants chose to do so was to agree with that it's really morally justified, what their group did, compared to if another group, in this case the British, did the same thing. Then it wasn't morally justified for the British, but it was for Americans. And conversely, with British participants, we studied it wasn't justified for Americans to do this torture, but it was justified when it was our British soldiers who did so.
And if you would be so kind, and I probably should have asked this at the outset, can you generally describe the study? It had to do with torture, and it had individuals who were British assess their feelings about torture committed by members of their group, and they had those same individuals assess what would otherwise be viewed as torture committed by another group.
Sure. There were two studies where in one we had British nationals, and in the other study we had American nationals. In both cases we had them read, or we exposed them to a media report that was fairly evocative concerning the torture of a terrorist suspect. It wasn't a terrorist suspect planning to harm their nation per se, though. And then we told them that this torture, this quite detailed torture that was done to this suspect, was committed either by members of their group's military service, in the case of British participants, British service personnel, or in the case of the American participants, it was American military personnel. And then we studied, after they'd been exposed to this information about torture and varied who did it, We assessed how morally justifiable they thought the torture committed by either their own nation or another nation's security services was. And we assessed the extent to which they felt empathy for this victim of torture. We also assessed the extent to which they blamed this victim of torture. As these are two very well-known kinds of strategies to not feel empathy for the victim and to legitimize by blaming victims themselves for what happened to them as what we call mediators. That is, you can come to see it as morally justified when your group does it, to the extent that you say, hey, there's nothing to, I don't feel any emotional empathy for this poor person, and I think it's actually their own darn fault that this happened to them. That is exactly what we found, that among British nationals, when it was said to be the British military service who had committed the torture, they felt less empathy for the victim, and they saw it as justified and therefore more moral than when, in that case, Americans were said to have done it. Conversely, when the participants were American nationals, they felt it was more moral, the torture committed when it was members of their own national military service who had done it, than when it was said to have been British military service who had committed the torture.
Do I have it correct that there are essentially three phases to the psychological reaction of individuals put in this position? Initially, it's a denial that there is torture, that what they're seeing is indeed torture. Then that gives way to changing the criteria or the definition for what is torture, which then gives way, when it can't be denied that it certainly is torture, a justification of the torture, giving rise to they brought it upon themselves or some other sort of justification.
Well, I wouldn't. Yes, very, very close. I wouldn't say that people would first deny this is torture, but rather that they're confronted with the torture, and it's an identity or a psychological problem for them when it's members of their own group who have committed this potentially horrible thing. So then you're confronted with, well, why would we do this? Well, if it's us, then there must have been some good reasons for it. It must really be it must be moral after all. And one way to arrive at that sense that it is moral, what we did, is to not empathize with those who are harmed with it, and to claim that it's their own fault. And to the extent that those kind of legitimization processes are activated, then you can walk away saying, yes, this torture was completely moral. Now, that process tends not to get activated when it's when the same torture, the same evocative, harmful content we're exposed to, and we believe it's some other group, then there's no psychological problem so much for us, because it's not about us then, it's about some other group, and then we are free to say, well, actually, maybe this isn't so moral, because after all, and we don't need to legitimize it to the same extent as when it's our own group.
So the question then becomes, Professor Branscombe, how do you get a group who has engaged in or activated this justification mechanism? How do you change that? How do you get them to go from justification to acknowledgement and indeed doing something about it to remedy?
Oh, that's a toughie, isn't it? Now, there are clearly some people who really value their group identity and who are not engaging in justification. So when the recent torture report was presented in Congress, I believe it was Senator Feinstein, who is a good American, who probably, I assume, values her identity as an American. I'm talking beyond the data here, but never mind. Who comes to question, how could we do this, and how can we become a better group and never do this again? Not everyone all the time will justify their group's actions, but it's a very common strategy.
Certainly the rub then is police officers coming in contact with typically young black males, as we've seen in the news. Then the question then is, go ahead.
There will be a temptation by most in-group members to justify the actions taken by members of their own group.
Now, what I've heard, that when police officers are confronted with bare statistics of their conduct, that then leads to them initiating the change in their own conduct. Does that fit with your analysis?
Yes, that makes sense. It certainly makes sense in analysis of discrimination as well. There have been many important cases in which people really are unaware that their institution is systematically allocating women worse resources, fewer resources, worse salaries than men when they hire them. So when this is systematically made clear, and it's not always the case that, when you look at it just a case-by-case basis, you can say, well, yeah, but this guy had this or this woman had that, and so on. But when you, as you're describing, you combine the cases and you can see then there's something systematic going on that can't be explained by, something different here or one instance. This is how we correct it. We come to acknowledge that discrimination really is occurring in an institution. There's a famous case of MIT, a dean who was confronted with inequality being created in its treatment of women faculty versus male faculty. And it wasn't once confronted with the systematic nature of it, that it isn't just involving a single case that could be accounted for in a whole variety of ways, then yes, and in fact, he instituted real change, improved the resources and made them equal to that of which male faculty were receiving. So, I'm certainly not suggesting that people can't change the nature of their institution or that they're only going to protect their group's identity. Remember, in the torture work that we were looking at, our participants had no way of actually doing anything. They're very different than U.S. senators who can actually try to do something, change policy, so that the institution itself can be prevented from doing such things again. So what I'm trying to say is, yes, it's possible that people will, especially when they're presented with systematic evidence, they will be persuaded by that and want to make their institution or their group better, more moral, and will attempt to bring about real change. That's also possible.
One other point that I wanted to touch on with you, let me just read this snippet to you. It says, the authors first consider prevailing models of racism and then discuss existing social psychological research with an emphasis on the work in this volume that challenges the prevailing models. Ring bell?
Yes, it does. I know exactly what that is.
Tell me what that is.
The conclusions chapter to a book 5 of us here at KU in social psychology co-edited together. It was called Commemorating Brown, the Social Psychology of Racism and Discrimination. And there, what we wanted to look at is how do both the public and psychologists, how have we thought about racism and discrimination historically, and what is wrong with some elements of it. So, for example, we've assumed that racism is to be found inside individuals rather than inside institutions and practices. It's not just that some people are racist and some aren't, but rather institutions facilitate racist outcomes, for example. It's also the case that racism or sexism, discrimination can be operating even with very similar forms of treatment being experienced, precisely because members of disadvantaged groups come into situations aware that their social identity is devalued. And so this very threat to their identity can undermine their performance in important situations. So it isn't just that we have to treat everybody identical, but we have to also recognize that people come to the situation with a devalued identity, and that can undermine their actual performance no matter how hard they try. So when that identity is salient, in this literature it's called stereotype threat. So in that work, what we tried to do was to talk about what are the assumptions of racism that is in people's heads, and in what ways do we know that racism and discrimination can actually operate in other ways.
So what indeed are those assumptions? Is that what you spoke about just a moment ago, that one of the main assumptions is that it's within individuals as opposed to within institutions?
Yes, right. Yes, so just as I just was saying, we may assume that racism is a property of individuals, but actually we should maybe be thinking about it as a property of institutions and practices, not of individuals themselves. That doesn't mean that we can't have extreme individuals, but we can have racist outcomes even in well-meaning people.
Fantastic. That's amazing, Professor Branscombe. It is so incredibly eye-opening and refreshing to have it systematized. Having a systematized way of being able to think about it is just so empowering. It's amazing.
Oh, fabulous, fabulous. So like the example I gave you of the MIT dean, he didn't think that MIT, that he was sexist, but when confronted with the evidence that women who are hired here at this wonderful institution are systematically receiving different starting offers, they're receiving different lab space, different kinds of resources, and then, it's not, we shouldn't be thinking about it as he or that individual as the problem. Rather, we need to be thinking about the practices in the institution that's producing these kind of differential outcomes.
And is that what the statement, and I'm quoting from the abstract, the implications of this research have not yet filtered into the implicit models of oppression that inform scientific thought and everyday understanding, that we're still stuck we're focusing on the individual as being racist as opposed to extending our assessment to the institution and the practices?
Yes. There were several assumptions that we went through, including, a little review of stereotype threat work and so on, and also that we don't interrogate the nature of privilege. See, one group could be getting advantages that the other group isn't getting, and that may not be noticed as discrimination, whereas if the other group is systematically getting less, we may more readily notice that. Do you see what I mean?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So the nature of privilege itself is also not something that's interrogated very closely, I think.
And finally, Professor Branscombe, what are the implications, in your view, of looking at it as the individual as opposed to the institution and the practice?
Well, if we only look at it as an individual, we may miss a lot of the action. Since differential treatment is often embedded in the way in which we do business, so to speak.
Professor Nyla Branscombe, University of Kansas. You can find links to all of the information that was referred to in that interview and on today's show at our Facebook page, Mindset Show, Facebook page, facebook.com/Mindset Show page, and on our newly designed website at mindsetshow.com. Again, we always tweet with the handle at Mindset Show. The upshot of what Professor Branscombe had to say, I thought, was, as you could tell by my reaction, and she's so enthusiastic. I had a great time talking to her. Felt like I was at the head of the class. Insightful. Nothing less than insightful. And it comes down to something that I heard an MBA business student talk about once. That is, the idea in business is that if you can't manage it if you don't measure it. If you don't measure it, you can't manage it. So if we measure what we're doing objectively, indeed, we might be able to get a handle on it. Until next week, for Mindset Mental Health News and Information, I'm your host, James Curtis. Dare to see mental health differently, because understanding why we do what we do can help us all do better. See you next week.